The Union Station platform shimmered with afternoon heat on August 14, 1968. Los Angeles sprawled around the Grand Terminal like a restless giant, its air thick with exhaust fumes and the distant wail of police sirens. The city was still reeling from the riots that had torn through Watts 3 years earlier, and the assassination of Robert Kennedy just 2 months before had left a wound that hadn't begun to heal. Margaret Chen adjusted the collar of her powder blue dress and checked her watch for the third time in as many minutes. The train to San Francisco, the Coast Starlight, was running late, which seemed fitting for a journey she had been dreading for weeks. At 24, she was being sent north to marry a man she had met only twice, both times under the watchful eyes of their families. Her parents, who ran a small grocery store in Chinatown, had made it clear that this marriage was not just her duty, but her salvation. A respectable match, her mother had said, as if Margaret's own dreams of becoming a journalist were nothing more than childish fancy. She clutched her small suitcase tighter, feeling the weight of the journal hidden inside, pages filled with observations about the changing city, about the protesters and the police, about the gap between the America promised in newspapers and the America she witnessed every day. Nearby, Tommy Walker paced with the nervous energy of a man running from something. At 19, he was thin as a rail, with shaggy brown hair that fell past his collar and a denim jacket covered in hand-sewn patches, peace signs, flowers, slogans against the war. His draft notice had arrived 3 weeks ago. In 7 days, he was supposed to report to Fort Ord for basic training, destined for the jungles of Vietnam where boys his age were dying by the thousands. But Tommy had other plans. He had a cousin in Vancouver who had already made the crossing, and a contact in San Francisco who could help him get there. His duffel bag contained everything he owned: 3 changes of clothes, a battered copy of On the Road, and $200 he'd saved from working construction. Every time a policeman walked past, Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs. Desertion, draft dodging. The words carried weight like stones. "Excuse me, is this the line for the Coast Starlight?" Tommy turned to see a black woman in her 30s, elegantly dressed in a burgundy suit despite the heat. Her hair was pressed and styled perfectly, her makeup impeccable. She carried herself with the kind of dignity that seemed to create its own space in the crowded station. "Yes, ma'am," Tommy said, gesturing to the growing crowd near Gate 7. "Should be boarding any minute now." "Thank you." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Delilah Morrison. Pleased to meet you." "Tommy Walker." He shook her extended hand, noticing the way other passengers, particularly the older white couples, kept their distance from her, creating an invisible perimeter of segregation even here in supposedly progressive California. Delilah noticed his noticing. "Some things change slower than others," she said quietly. She was traveling north to Oakland, to the funeral of her younger brother. Marcus had been a bright kid, a junior at UC Berkeley, involved in the Black Student Union. 3 nights ago, he'd been found dead in his apartment, officially ruled a drug overdose. Though Marcus had never touched drugs in his life, the police had barely investigated. Another dead black radical, they seemed to think. Another problem solving itself. She had quit her job as a secretary at a law firm in downtown LA to make the trip. Her boss had made it clear she wouldn't be welcome back. The loudspeaker crackled to life. "Now boarding Gate 7 Coast Starlight service to San Francisco with stops in Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, Salinas, and San Jose. All passengers please proceed to the platform." Margaret took a deep breath and joined the flow of people moving toward the gates. The crowd was a cross-section of late 60s America, businessmen in narrow ties, hippies with flowers in their hair, families with children, elderly couples, a few servicemen in uniform heading back to their posts. As she showed her ticket to the conductor, she caught sight of her reflection in the train's polished exterior. For a moment she saw not herself, but her mother at the same age, boarding a ship in Hong Kong with nothing but hope and terror in her heart. The train was older than most in service, a vintage 1940s streamliner that had been retrofitted and repainted, but still retained the Art Deco elegance of its original design. Margaret found her seat in car number 7, settling in by the window. Tommy dropped into the seat across the aisle, while Delilah moved further back, noting with bitter familiarity that she was the only black passenger in the car. Others filed in. An elderly veteran named Earl Patterson, his chest heavy with medals from 2 wars, traveling to visit his daughter in San Jose. A young couple, bright-eyed newlyweds named Susan and David Brooks, heading to San Francisco for their honeymoon. A middle-aged salesman named Harold Nichols, carrying cases of samples and smelling faintly of bourbon, even though it wasn't yet 3 in the afternoon. A Catholic priest, Father Michael O'Shea, his black cassock dusty from travel, bound for a parish assignment in Santa Barbara. A teenage girl named Lisa Yamamoto, running away from a foster home in Gardena, hoping to find her real mother who she believed was living somewhere in San Francisco's Japantown. 13 passengers in total, not counting the crew. The train jerked into motion with a metallic groan, and Union Station began to slide away. Margaret pressed her face to the window, watching Los Angeles unfold and disappear. The industrial warehouses, the river basin lined with homeless encampments, the suburbs spreading like a beige infection across the valley. Somewhere out there was the grocery store where she had spent every day of her childhood, the desk at Lincoln High where she had written her first article for the school newspaper, the city she was leaving behind. Tommy pulled out a paperback but couldn't focus on the words. His mind kept cycling through the same desperate mathematics. 7 days until he had to report, 3 days to get to Vancouver if the connection in San Francisco worked out, an entire lifetime of exile stretching beyond that. His father, a World War II veteran who still woke up screaming from nightmares about Anzio, had called him a coward. His mother had wept but said nothing, which was somehow worse. The train picked up speed, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails creating a hypnotic soundtrack. Outside, the landscape shifted from urban to suburban to industrial to rural, the afternoon sun painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Father O'Shea dozed in his seat, his rosary beads clicking softly against the armrest. The newlyweds whispered and giggled together, lost in their own bubble of joy. Harold Nichols had already started on the small flask he kept in his jacket pocket. Despite the no-alcohol signs posted throughout the car, Earl Patterson stared out the window at the passing scenery, his weathered face unreadable, seeing perhaps other landscapes, other journeys, other trains carrying young men toward their destinies. It was Delilah who first noticed something was wrong. They had been traveling for about 45 minutes somewhere between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara, when she realized the scenery had stopped changing. They were passing through a stretch of coastal mountains, the Pacific visible in the distance, but something about the light seemed off. The sun appeared to be frozen in the sky, the shadows cast by the mountains remaining at the same angle minute after minute. She stood and walked to the window, pressing her hand against the glass. It was warm, almost hot, despite the air conditioning. Other passengers were beginning to stir, to murmur among themselves. "Is it just me?" Tommy said aloud. "Or are we going really fast?" He was right. The landscape was beginning to blur, the individual trees and rocks blending into streams of color. The clacking of the wheels had accelerated into a high-pitched whine, but there was no sensation of speed inside the car, no increased pressure, no difficulty walking or moving. "Something's wrong," Margaret whispered, her journalist's instinct for wrongness suddenly screaming in her mind. The conductor appeared at the front of the car, a portly man named Mr. Henshaw, who had been with the railroad for 30 years. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he gripped the seats for support. "Folks, I need everyone to remain calm," he said, though his voice betrayed his own panic. "We're experiencing some kind of technical malfunction. The engineer's working to bring us to a safe stop." "What kind of malfunction?" Harold Nichols demanded, his words slightly slurred. "We're going 100 miles an hour." "Sir, please." But before Mr. Henshaw could continue, the lights in the car flickered and died. For a moment they were plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the windows. And through those windows, the passengers could see something impossible. The landscape was no longer blurring. It was disintegrating. The mountains, the ocean, the sky itself seemed to be breaking apart into streams of light and shadow, like a painting melting in the rain. Colors that didn't exist in nature swirled past the windows, purples and greens and colors that had no names, that hurt to look at. Susan Brooks screamed. Her new husband wrapped his arms around her, but his own eyes were wide with terror. The whining of the wheels had become deafening, a sound like metal screaming. The entire train shuddered and bucked, throwing passengers from their seats. Margaret tumbled into the aisle, her suitcase breaking open and scattering her belongings. Tommy grabbed onto the seat in front of him, his knuckles white. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The lights came back on. The sound of the wheels returned to their normal rhythm. Through the windows they could see ordinary landscape, scrub brush and hills and a gray sky that suggested late evening. though it had been mid-afternoon just moments before. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. They sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. It was Earl Patterson who finally broke the spell. The old veteran rose slowly to his feet, his face grim. "I think," he said in a voice that had commanded men in combat, "we need to figure out where the hell we are." Mr. Henshaw stumbled to the emergency intercom, his hands shaking as he pressed the button. Static answered him. He tried again. More static. "The engineer's not responding," he said, his voice cracking. "I need to get to the locomotive." "I'll come with you," Earl said. It wasn't a request. The two men made their way forward through the car, and the remaining passengers could only sit and wait, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. Margaret retrieved her scattered belongings with mechanical precision, her mind racing to find a rational explanation for what had just occurred. A hallucination? Mass hysteria? Some kind of military experiment? But deep down, she knew that what they had experienced was beyond any of those explanations. Delilah returned to her seat and closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. Her brother's funeral seemed very far away now, a problem from another life. Tommy stared at his reflection in the window, and for the first time in weeks, the draft notice didn't seem like the most pressing concern in his world. When Earl and Mr. Henshaw returned 20 minutes later, their faces told the story before their words could. "The crew is gone," Earl said simply. "Engineer, fireman, brakeman, all gone. The locomotive is running on its own, and none of us knows how to stop it." "That's impossible," Harold Nichols said, though the protest was weak, ritual. Impossibility had already been established as irrelevant. "There's more," Mr. Henshaw added, his voice barely above a whisper. "I managed to get the radio working for a moment. Just for a moment. I heard—" He swallowed hard. "I heard someone say it was October 2004. They were talking about a presidential election between someone named Bush and someone named Kerry." The car erupted in protests, in denials, in nervous laughter. 2004? That was 36 years in the future. Ridiculous. Impossible. But Margaret found herself looking at her watch. It had stopped at 3:47 p.m. She looked around the car and saw others checking their watches, their faces draining of color as they realized the same thing. Every timepiece on the train had stopped at exactly the same moment. "This is insane," Father O'Shea said, making the sign of the cross. "This is absolutely insane." "We need to stay calm," Delilah said, her voice cutting through the rising panic. "Whatever's happened, we need to work together. Fighting among ourselves won't help." She was right, and everyone knew it. Slowly, the protests died down. The passengers looked at each other, strangers bound together by impossible circumstances, refugees from 1968 hurtling through time or space or dimensions, unknown toward a destination none of them could predict. Outside the windows, the landscape continued to roll past, ordinary and familiar and completely alien all at once. The train maintained its steady speed, carrying them forward, always forward, with no one at the controls and no way to stop. Margaret pulled out her journal and began to write, documenting everything she could remember. It was what a journalist did: bear witness, record truth, even when truth became impossible. Especially then. Tommy put his head in his hands and tried to remember the feeling of solid ground beneath his feet. Delilah thought about her brother, about unfinished business, about all the futures that had just become unknowable. And the train rolled on through the gray twilight, carrying 13 passengers toward a destination none of them could imagine, away from a world that might no longer exist, into a mystery that had no name. The clock on the wall remained frozen at 3:47 p.m., August 14th, 1968. But somewhere outside, if Mr. Henshaw had heard correctly, it was October 2004, and the world they had known was 36 years gone. The train continued through the night, and night itself became strange. Through the windows, the passengers could see a sky that wasn't quite right, stars in positions that seemed incorrect, a moon that appeared and disappeared without following any logical pattern, and occasionally, just for moments, complete darkness or blinding light that had nothing to do with celestial bodies. Margaret had filled 6 pages of her journal with observations, trying to maintain the disciplined eye of a reporter, even as everything she knew about reality crumbled around her. She noted that while their watches had stopped, they could still feel the passage of time, hunger, fatigue, the need to use the bathroom. Time existed for them, even if it seemed not to exist for the train. Around 10 p.m. by Margaret's estimation, the group had gathered in the center of the car for what Earl Patterson called a council of war. 13 people sat in a rough circle, faces illuminated by the flickering overhead lights that kept threatening to fail entirely. "We need to establish some facts," Earl began, his military training asserting itself. "First, we're trapped on a train with no crew and no way to stop it. Second, something impossible happened to us. Third, we need to survive until we can figure this out." "Survive?" Harold Nichols laughed bitterly, his breath still reeking of bourbon. "What are we supposed to survive on? I didn't exactly pack for a long journey." "There's a dining car," Mr. Henshaw said. "Standard provisions. Should be enough food for several days if we ration carefully. Water tanks are full, we won't starve." "Several days?" Susan Brooks whispered, clutching her husband's hand. "We can't be on this train for several days. I have a job. We have reservations at a hotel. This was supposed to be our honeymoon." Her husband David pulled her closer. "We'll figure it out, Sue. We'll get through this." "Will we?" Father O'Shea leaned forward, his face haggard. "Has anyone considered that what happened to us might have been divine intervention? Judgment? Judgment for what?" Delilah's voice was sharp. "For being on a train? For trying to live our lives? For our sins?" the priest insisted. "For the state of the world. Vietnam, the riots, the assassinations. Maybe God has decided enough is enough." "That's bullshit," Tommy interjected. His hands were shaking, and he couldn't seem to make them stop. "This isn't God. This is... I don't know what this is, but it's not God." "How would you know?" Lisa Yamamoto spoke up for the first time, her teenage voice small but defiant. "How would any of us know what God would do?" An uncomfortable silence followed. Margaret watched the group dynamics with her trained eye. They were fragmenting already, splitting along fault lines of fear and philosophy. If they couldn't find common ground, couldn't work together, things would deteriorate quickly. "What if," she said carefully, choosing her words, "we focus on what we can control? We can't stop the train or understand what happened yet, but we can take care of each other, make sure everyone has food and water, take shifts watching for anything unusual." "More unusual than this?" Harold snorted, but there were nods around the circle. "The lady's right," Earl said. "We organize ourselves, assign responsibilities, keep busy. It's how you survive. You focus on the mission in front of you, not the big picture you can't change." They spent the next hour dividing tasks. Mr. Henshaw and Earl would continue to try to access the locomotive, to understand the train systems. Margaret and Delilah volunteered to inventory their supplies and set up a rationing system. Tommy and David Brooks would explore the entire train, mapping its layout and checking for any other passengers or crew they might have missed. Father O'Shea and Lisa would organize the sleeping arrangements. There was a sleeper car attached to their coach, though not all of the compartments had been sold for this journey. As the meeting broke up, Margaret found herself walking with Delilah toward the dining car. The older woman moved with purpose, her heels clicking on the metal floor despite the uncertainty of their situation. "You're keeping it together better than most," Margaret observed. Delilah smiled without humor. "I've had practice. When you're a black woman in America, you learn early that the world doesn't make sense, that rules apply differently to different people, that impossibilities happen every day. This is just more obvious about it." They entered the dining car, a beautiful space with wood paneling and Art Deco fixtures, tables set with white linen and silver settings as if passengers would be arriving any moment for their evening meal. But the car was empty, abandoned, the kitchen beyond dark and still. Margaret flipped on the lights. The kitchen was well stocked, industrial refrigerators full of food, dry goods in the pantry, cases of water and soft drinks. Enough for weeks, if they were careful. "We could survive on this for a while," Delilah said, running her hands over the supplies. "But survival isn't the same as living, is it?" "What were you going to do?" Margaret asked. "In San Francisco, I mean, before this happened." Delilah's face tightened. "Bury my brother, then probably get arrested trying to make someone care about why he died." She paused. "And you? That dress looks like something you'd wear to something important. An arranged marriage." The words tasted bitter in Margaret's mouth. "My parents chose a husband for me. A good Chinese boy with a good job. I was supposed to be grateful. Were you? I was supposed to be a lot of things." Margaret sat down at one of the tables, suddenly exhausted. A good daughter, a good wife, quiet and obedient and satisfied with taking orders from men my whole life. I wanted to write, to report, to see things and tell people about them. That wasn't what good Chinese daughters did. Delilah sat across from her. My brother wanted to change the world. He believed in it, in justice, in revolution, in the idea that if you just fought hard enough, you could make things better. The night before he died, he called me, told me he was scared, said people were following him, that he'd learned something dangerous about the police, about what they were doing to student organizers. I told him to be careful. Her voice broke. I told him to be careful, and then he died. And I couldn't even get anyone to investigate properly because he was just another angry black kid to them. The two women sat in silence for a moment, two strangers bound by loss and displacement, by futures stolen and pasts that no longer seemed to matter. Maybe, Margaret said slowly, maybe whatever this is, wherever we're going, maybe it's a second chance, for all of us. Or maybe, Delilah replied, it's a different kind of ending. Meanwhile, Tommy and David Brooks made their way through the train car by car. Besides the coach where they'd been sitting, there was the dining car, a sleeper car with 8 private compartments, a baggage car, and finally the locomotive itself, still running on its own, still carrying them forward at a steady 60 miles per hour toward unknown destinations. This is insane, David kept repeating like a mantra. This is absolutely insane. Sue and I just got married 3 days ago. 3 days. We're supposed to be starting our life together, and instead we're trapped on a haunted train to nowhere. Tommy felt a strange kinship with the man despite their differences. I was running away, he admitted. From the draft. I got my notice. I was going to dodge to Canada. Figured I'd rather be a coward than dead. David looked at him with surprise, then understanding. I got a deferment. Medical. I have asthma. But half the guys I went to school with are over there. Some of them aren't coming back. He paused. I don't think you're a coward. My father does. Your father isn't here. They reached the baggage car, a dark space filled with suitcases and crates, mail bags and cargo containers bound for various destinations up the coast. Tommy's flashlight beam swept across labels and addresses, names of people who would never receive their packages, letters that would never be delivered. Wait, David said, pointing. What's that? In the corner, barely visible behind a stack of mail bags, was something that didn't belong. A metal cabinet, military gray with warning labels plastered across its surface. Tommy approached it carefully, his heart hammering. Don't touch it, David warned. Those labels, those are radiation warnings. Tommy stopped. The labels were indeed radiation warnings, along with other symbols he didn't recognize. The cabinet was locked with multiple seals, marked with serial numbers and what looked like military designations. What the hell is this doing on a passenger train? Tommy breathed. Nothing good, David replied. We need to tell the others. They backed away from the cabinet and made their way quickly toward the coach car. Behind them, in the darkness, the cabinet sat in silence, its contents unknown, its purpose mysterious, its presence on the train one more impossibility added to a growing list. Back in the coach car, the others had settled into an uneasy routine. Father O'Shea sat alone, his rosary beads clicking through his fingers in endless repetition. Lisa Yamamoto had curled up in one of the seats, her backpack clutched to her chest like a teddy bear. Harold Nichols had passed out, his flask empty, his snoring echoing through the car. Earl Patterson stood at the window, staring out at the passing landscape that still didn't quite make sense. He had been in 2 wars, had seen friends die, had jumped out of airplanes into enemy territory, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this, whatever this was. Mr. Henshaw sat at the conductor's station, frantically writing in a logbook, documenting everything as if the railroad company would somehow need his report. When Tommy and David burst in with their news about the metal cabinet, the fragile calm shattered. Radioactive materials? Earl's voice was sharp. On a passenger train? That's against every regulation in the book. Maybe that's why, Margaret said slowly, her journalist's mind working. Maybe that's why this happened. Maybe we were carrying something we shouldn't have been, something that caused whatever this was. You're saying the government did this to us? Delilah's voice was flat. Put us on a train with something dangerous and then, what? Made us disappear? I'm saying we need to consider every possibility. Father O'Shea stood up, his face flushed. This is judgment. I told you. We were carrying instruments of war, of destruction, and God has removed us from the world as punishment. Sit down, Father, Earl said firmly. Whatever's in that cabinet, it's still there and we're still here. If God wanted to punish us, he'd have done a more thorough job. The argument escalated, voices rising, fear and frustration boiling over. It was Susan Brooks, quiet until now, who finally shouted for silence. "Stop it. All of you, just stop." Her voice cracked with emotion. "Fighting doesn't help. Theories don't help. We're still stuck here, and we still don't know where we're going or how to get home. So either we work together or we fall apart. Those are our only choices." Her words hung in the air. Slowly, the group settled down, ashamed and exhausted. "She's right," Delilah said quietly. "We need to rest. Some of us need to sleep. We'll take shifts. 2 people awake at all times, watching. In the morning, we'll figure out our next move." They arranged the shifts. Earl and Mr. Henshaw would take the first watch, followed by Margaret and Tommy, then Delilah and David. The others found places to sleep, some in the sleeper car, some curled up in the coach seats. Lisa claimed a compartment in the sleeper car and locked the door, needing the illusion of safety that privacy provided. Margaret took the second watch with Tommy, sitting in the dining car with mugs of coffee that had long since gone cold. Outside, the landscape had settled into something more consistent, rolling hills under a star-filled sky that might have been normal if you didn't look too closely at the constellations. "Do you think we're dead?" Tommy asked suddenly. "Like, maybe we crashed and this is, I don't know, purgatory or something?" Margaret considered it. "I don't feel dead. I feel tired and scared and confused, but not dead. Maybe that's what death feels like. Maybe. But I don't think so. I think something happened to us. Something scientific, not supernatural. Some kind of accident or experiment. And wherever we are, whenever we are, we're still alive, still real. How can you be so calm about this?" "I'm not calm, I'm terrified. But I learned a long time ago that falling apart doesn't help. You document what you see. You find the story. You keep moving forward. It's the only way to survive." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "I was so scared of Vietnam, of dying in some rice paddy for a war nobody understands, and now," he laughed bitterly, "now I'd give anything to just be back in regular, normal danger." "Would you really?" He thought about it. "No, I guess not. But at least I'd know what I was afraid of." As they talked, neither of them noticed the train gradually slowing. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but by the time the sun began to rise, a sun that appeared too quickly and from the wrong direction, the train had reduced its speed significantly. Earl was the first to notice. He stood at the window of the coach car, watching the landscape become more and more detailed as their speed decreased. They were passing through what looked like farmland, neat fields and irrigation systems, modern buildings and solar panels that definitely didn't exist in 1968. "Everyone wake up," he called out. "Something's happening." The passengers stumbled from their sleeping places, groggy and disoriented. Through the windows they could see the world coming into focus. Road signs, buildings, cars that looked nothing like the vehicles they remembered. Sleek and rounded, too many of them matching the same few styles. "Those are Priuses," David said, his voice filled with wonder. "I've read about them. Hybrid cars. They're not supposed to exist yet. Not in production anyway." "Look at the signs," Margaret said, pressing her face to the glass. "That one says Salinas City Limits. We're in California. We're actually in California." The train continued to slow, the brakes engaging with a long metallic groan. Up ahead they could see a station. "Salinas Station," the sign proclaimed, though it looked different from any station any of them remembered. Modern, new, wrong. "What do we do?" Susan asked, her voice small. "We get off," Earl said firmly. "Whatever's waiting for us out there, it's better than staying on this train." The train eased into the station and came to a complete stop for the first time since the impossible had begun. Through the windows, they could see the platform, empty, except for a few people who looked at the vintage train with curiosity and confusion. Mr. Henshaw opened the doors. Fresh air, cool and smelling of morning and ocean salt, flooded into the car. One by one, the 13 passengers stepped off the train onto the platform of Salinas Station. The dateboard on the wall read, October 23, 2004. 36 years had passed in what felt like a single night, and as they stood there, 13 people displaced in time, the train's doors closed behind them with a hydraulic hiss. The locomotive began to move, pulling away from the station, gathering speed until it rounded a curve and disappeared from view. An empty train with no passengers, no crew, heading toward destinations unknown. The 13 looked at each other, then at the strange new world around them, the cell phones people carried, The modern clothes, the cars, the technology visible everywhere. They were strangers in a foreign land, refugees from 1968 standing in 2004, with no way back and no idea what came next. Margaret pulled out her journal and wrote a single line. "We have arrived." Now what? The Salinas police station was a monument to 2004's sterile bureaucracy. Gray walls, fluorescent lights, computers on every desk, humming with internal processes the 13 passengers couldn't begin to understand. They sat in a conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, each of them in various states of shock as officers moved in and out, speaking in hushed tones and casting wary glances at the impossible people who had materialized at their train station. Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret, though the shared surname felt like a cosmic joke, sat across from them with a tape recorder that was digital now. No spinning reels, just a small device with a glowing LED. She was in her late 30s, professional and thorough, and clearly struggling to maintain her composure. "Let me make sure I understand," she said for the third time, her voice carefully controlled. "You all boarded a train in Los Angeles on August 14th, 1968. The train experienced some kind of anomaly, and now you're here in 2004 having aged not at all." "That's correct," Earl Patterson said. He had appointed himself spokesman for the group, the natural authority figure. "I know how it sounds, Detective. Believe me, if I were in your position, I wouldn't believe it either. Your driver's licenses are from 1968. Your clothes are from 1968. Hell, even the train you arrived on is a 1940s vintage that was decommissioned from regular service in 1972. She rubbed her eyes. "We've called in the FBI. They're sending a team from San Francisco. Until then, you're all going to have to stay here." "We're not criminals," Delilah said sharply. "We're victims of something. We didn't choose this." "I understand, ma'am, but you have to understand our position. 13 people with no modern identification, no records of existing for the past 36 years, claiming to have traveled through time. We're not claiming anything," Margaret interrupted. "We're telling you what happened. Whether you believe it or not is your problem, not ours." The detective's phone rang, except it wasn't a phone like they remembered, but a small device clipped to her belt that chirped like a bird. She answered it, listened, and her face went pale. "I need to take this," she said, standing abruptly and leaving the room. The 13 sat in silence, each processing the overwhelming reality of their situation in different ways. Lisa Yamamoto hadn't stopped crying since they'd been brought to the station. The teen had been 15 in 1968. She would technically be 51 now. Her mother, if she was even still alive, would be in her 70s. The future she'd been running toward had disappeared. Harold Nichols had demanded alcohol and been refused. He sat now in sullen silence, hands shaking, facing the reality that whatever life he'd left behind, business contacts, clients, his apartment in Long Beach, no longer existed in any meaningful way. The Brooks couple clung to each other, 3 days married in their perception, but the wedding they'd left behind was 36 years ago. Their families had aged or died. The life they'd planned together had been stolen before it could begin. Father O'Shea prayed quietly, his crisis of faith evident in every whispered word. If this was God's judgment, what was the punishment? If it wasn't, where was God in all of this? Tommy Walker stared at nothing. The draft notice that had defined his life for weeks was meaningless now. The Vietnam War was decades over. He'd dodged it by the most extreme method imaginable, running 36 years into the future. But at what cost? The door opened and Detective Chen returned, followed by a man in a dark suit who had federal agent written all over him. He was in his 50s, gray-haired and grim-faced, carrying a briefcase that clicked open with military precision. "My name is Agent William Cross," he said without preamble. "I'm with a special division of the FBI that handles unusual cases. I've been briefed on your situation, and I need to ask you some questions about the train you were on." "What kind of questions?" Earl asked, his military instincts recognizing authority when he saw it. "The Coast Starlight route you were on was selected for a classified transport operation in August of 1968. A cargo was being moved from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Experimental materials related to nuclear research. The shipment never arrived. It disappeared, along with the train and everyone on it." He paused. "The government officially classified it as an accident, a derailment into the ocean, but the train was never found. Until now." "The cabinet," Tommy said. "The one in the baggage car, with the radiation symbols. Agent Cross's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. You saw it? We found it. Didn't open it. The warnings were pretty clear. Where is it now? On the train, which left the station after we got off. David Brooks leaned forward. What was in it? What were you transporting? That's classified. Classified? Margaret's voice rose. We just lost 36 years of our lives because of your classified cargo, and you're not going to tell us what it was? Agent Cross sat down, his movements deliberate. In 1968, there were several competing theories about temporal mechanics, the physics of time itself. Some researchers believed that certain radioactive isotopes under specific conditions could create localized temporal distortions. The military was interested in weaponizing this. Imagine being able to send enemy troops forward or backward in time, effectively removing them from the battlefield without killing them. The room was completely silent. The experiment was unauthorized, Cross continued. A rogue team of scientists managed to secure funding through classified channels. They created what they called a temporal displacement device, powered by an extremely unstable isotope. The plan was to transport it to a secure facility in Northern California for controlled testing. They chose the Coast Starlight because it was a civilian train, less likely to attract attention than a military convoy. You put us on a train with a bomb, Delilah said, her voice cold. You used civilians as cover for transporting a weapon. I didn't. I was 9 years old in 1968. But yes, that's essentially what happened. The device was supposed to be inert during transport. Obviously, something went wrong. Something went wrong? Harold Nichols laughed hysterically. Something went wrong? We've been erased from history, and you call that something went wrong? I understand your anger. You don't understand anything. Susan Brooks was on her feet, tears streaming down her face. You didn't lose everything. You didn't wake up in a world where everyone you loved is old or dead, where nothing makes sense, where you don't exist. Agent Cross waited for her to finish, his face impassive. You're right. I can't understand what you've been through, but I can help you navigate what comes next. The government will provide support, new identities, financial assistance, counseling. You'll be taken care of. Taken care of, Earl repeated. Like cattle. Or like problems to be managed. Like people who experience something traumatic and need help adjusting to a world that's moved on without them. Margaret stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Salinas streets bustled with 2004 life. Cars that looked like toys from science fiction. People talking to their palms. Cell phones, she'd learned they were called. Technology everywhere. How much has changed? She asked quietly. Everything, Agent Cross said. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Internet, a global computer network, connects billions of people. We've been to Mars with robotic probes. Cell phones are everywhere. 2 towers in New York were destroyed by terrorists in 2001, killing thousands. We've been at war in Iraq and Afghanistan for years. He paused. The world you left doesn't exist anymore. Even the language has changed. Words you knew have different meanings now, or new meanings have been added. You're going to feel like aliens on your own planet. What about the train? Tommy asked. Where did it go after it dropped us off? We don't know. We've had reports of sightings. Vintage trains appearing on tracks where they shouldn't be, disappearing before authorities can reach them. Our working theory is that the temporal displacement is still ongoing, that the device is still active somewhere on that train. It might be cycling through time, picking up passengers and depositing them in different eras. So there might be other people. Margaret turned from the window. Other passengers who experienced what we did? Possibly. We've investigated several disappearances over the years that might be related, but until we find the train and neutralize the device, we can't know for sure. The door opened again, and a young woman in her 20s entered, carrying a stack of files. She stopped short when she saw the group, her eyes widening. These are the people? She asked Agent Cross. Yes. Dr. Reeves, meet the passengers of the 1968 Coast Starlight incident. Dr. Emily Reeves was a physicist, one of the few civilians with clearance to work on temporal anomaly cases. She looked at the 13 with a mixture of awe and sympathy. I've studied your case for my entire career, she said. I never thought I'd meet you. I never thought it was possible. Neither did we, Margaret replied dryly. Over the next several hours, the passengers were processed, fingerprinted, photographed, interviewed individually and in groups. Dr. Reeves ran medical tests, documenting the fact that despite 36 years passing, They had aged only about 24 hours. Their cells, their tissues, even their telomeres were consistent with people who had left Los Angeles yesterday, not in 1968. "It's as if you were in stasis," she explained to Margaret during one of the breaks. "Time passed around you, but not for you. You're temporal refugees, displaced persons in the most literal sense." "Can we go back?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Not with our current technology. We barely understand what happened to you, much less how to reverse it. You're stuck here in 2004. I'm sorry." Margaret nodded slowly. She'd known, really. Known from the moment they'd stepped off that train that there was no going back. No return to the life she'd been living. The wedding she'd dreaded would never happen. The parents who had controlled her life were gone. Her father had died in 1987, her mother in 1999, according to the records Agent Cross had pulled up. The grocery store was now a parking lot. She was free. Free from obligation, from expectation, from the weight of being a good Chinese daughter. But the price of that freedom was everything else she'd known. She wasn't the only one facing these realizations. Delilah had learned that the investigation into her brother's death had been closed within a week of the funeral she'd never attended. The police had ruled it an overdose, case closed. Marcus had been buried in Oakland. His gravestone had weathered 36 years. The Black Student Union he'd been part of had evolved, changed, become something different. The revolution he'd believed in had happened and failed, and happened again in different forms, and the world had moved on. Tommy discovered that the Vietnam War had ended in 1975, 7 years after he'd left. The draft had been abolished in 1973. Men his age who had gone to war were now in their 50s, many of them damaged by the experience, many others who had simply gone on with their lives. The cousin he'd planned to stay with in Vancouver had died in 1993. There was no one left from his old life except a sister in Phoenix who was now 53 and had given him up for dead decades ago. The Brooks couple learned that both sets of their parents had passed away, Susan's in the early 90s, David's more recently. Their wedding, which had felt so monumentally important, had been forgotten by everyone except themselves. They had no home, no jobs, no context in this new world except each other. Earl Patterson's daughter was now 64, living in a retirement community in San Diego. His wife had remarried in 1975 to a good man according to the records, and had lived until 1998. The wars he'd fought in had been superseded by new wars, new conflicts, and the medals he carried had become historical curiosities. Father O'Shea discovered that the Catholic Church had undergone massive changes. Vatican II had transformed many practices, but had also led to schisms and controversies. The parish he'd been assigned to in Santa Barbara had closed in 1987. Priests were under suspicion now, Agent Cross informed him gently, because of widespread abuse scandals. His collar might attract hostility rather than respect. Lisa Yamamoto, 15 years old and now technically 51, learned that her mother had died in 1979, never knowing what had happened to her daughter. The foster system that had failed her was still failing children, though in different ways. Japantown in San Francisco still existed but had shrunk, gentrified, become something different. Harold Nichols learned that his sales territory, his clients, his entire business model had been obsolete for decades. The company he'd worked for had been bought out in the 80s, restructured, bought out again, and finally dissolved. His apartment had been rented to someone else within months of his disappearance. Mr. Henshaw discovered that the railroad he'd worked for had been absorbed into Amtrak in 1971, that passenger rail travel had declined dramatically, that the career he'd devoted his life to was now a shadow of what it had been. Each of them faced their own version of loss, their own reckoning with displacement. They were people out of time, with no place in the world they'd landed in. It was late afternoon when Agent Cross gathered them together again. "The government is prepared to offer you a settlement," he said. "Housing, financial support, assistance with establishing new identities. You'll each receive a social security number, birth certificates that have been backdated into the system, and enough money to get started. It's not perfect, but it's what we can do." "What's the catch?" Earl asked. "You signed non-disclosure agreements. What happened to you remains classified. As far as the world is concerned, you're people who went off the grid in 1968 and are now re-emerging. Nomads, wanderers, people who dropped out, not time travelers. And if we refuse?" Delilah asked. "You're free to refuse, but without government assistance, you'll have no identification, No way to work legally, no access to social services. You'll be effectively invisible. Margaret looked around at the others. They were broken, traumatized, displaced, but they were also survivors. They had made it through the impossible and arrived on the other side. I want something else, she said. I want access to the investigation, to the files on what happened to us. I want to understand it. That's not possible. Make it possible. I'm a journalist, or I was. I can help you document this, understand it. Whatever happened to us might happen to others. Don't you want to prevent that? Agent Cross studied her for a long moment. I'll see what I can do. The 13 spent the next 3 days in a government facility in San Francisco, being processed and prepared for re-entry into society. They attended classes on how to use computers, how cell phones worked, about the internet and email, and all the technology that had become ubiquitous. They learned about the political landscape, the cultural changes, the ways the world had shifted beneath their feet. They also learned about each other. In their shared displacement, they formed bonds that went deeper than ordinary friendship. They were fellow survivors of an experience no one else could understand. On the 4th day, they were released. Each of them received an envelope with new identification, a bank account with $50,000, and a phone number to call if they needed help. They stood outside the facility in the San Francisco morning, 13 people about to scatter to new lives. What will you do? Tommy asked Margaret. Find the truth, she said, about what happened to us, about that train, about whether there are others. She looked at him. You? I don't know. Maybe finally read all those books I was supposed to read. Maybe find out what peace looks like. He smiled sadly. I've got a lot of time to figure it out. They said their goodbyes, promising to stay in touch, though they all knew that the bonds formed in trauma often couldn't survive normalcy. Earl headed to San Diego to find his daughter. The Brooks couple decided to stay in San Francisco, to build the life together that had been stolen from them. Delilah went to Oakland, to stand at her brother's grave 3 decades late. Father O'Shea went to a Jesuit retreat center, seeking answers to questions that had no answers. Lisa, still legally a minor despite her temporal age, entered a special program for displaced youth. Harold Nichols took his money and disappeared, seeking oblivion in a world he didn't understand. Margaret checked into a small hotel in the Mission District and spent the first week just walking the streets, observing this strange new San Francisco. The city was familiar and alien at once, gentrified now with coffee shops and tech companies where counterculture had once flourished. The future had arrived, and it wasn't what anyone had predicted. She bought a laptop, her first computer, and began to research. The internet, she discovered, was both miraculous and overwhelming, an ocean of information where you could drown or sail. She learned about the other disappearances Agent Cross had mentioned. A family that vanished from a highway in 1975 never found. A school bus that disappeared in 1982 with 23 children aboard, no trace ever discovered. A commercial flight in 1990 that went missing between Denver and Chicago, the wreckage never recovered. Were they all on that train, cycling through time, being deposited in different eras? Or were there multiple devices, multiple accidents, a whole underworld of temporal displacement that the government was hiding? She contacted Dr. Reeves, who agreed to meet her at a cafe near Berkeley. The physicist arrived with a thick file of papers, glancing around nervously before sitting down. I could lose my job for this, Emily said, but I think you deserve to know. The device that was on your train, it wasn't the only one. There were 3 prototypes. One was on your train. One is missing, lost during transport in 1975. The third is in a secure facility in Nevada, inactive but still highly dangerous. So there could be other people, Margaret breathed. Other trains, other buses, other planes. Possibly, probably. The device seems to create what we call temporal resonances, echoes in the fabric of time. Once activated, they don't fully deactivate. They create pockets where time moves differently, or loops, or skips forward. We've detected these resonances but can't predict where or when they'll manifest. People could be trapped in those pockets. Yes, or being moved through time like you were. We don't know. We can't access them. All we can do is monitor for anomalies and try to help people when they emerge. Margaret leaned back, her mind racing. I want to write about this. Document it. Not the classified parts. I signed the NDA. But the human stories. What it's like to lose everything. To be displaced in time to help others if they emerge. Emily smiled. I think that's a good idea. And Margaret, I'm glad you made it through. Whatever comes next, I think you're going to be okay. 6 months later, Margaret had an apartment in Oakland, a job as a freelance writer, and a growing file of stories about the displaced. She'd found 3 others, people who had experienced temporal anomalies, though none as dramatic as hers. A man who had lost 2 weeks in 1987, appearing 30 miles from where he'd started with no memory of the gap. A woman who claimed to have lived the same day 3 times in 1995, before it finally moved forward. A teenager who had aged 10 years in what felt like a single night in 1999. She interviewed them all, documenting their experiences, building a record of the impossible. The stories couldn't be published yet. The NDAs were clear about that. But someday, she thought, someday the truth would come out. She stayed in touch with some of the other passengers. Earl called every few weeks from San Diego, where his daughter had welcomed him back with tears and disbelief. They were rebuilding their relationship, learning to navigate the gap between who he had been and who he was now. The Brooks couple sent Christmas cards with pictures of the apartment they'd rented, the ordinary life they were building. They were happy, they wrote, in a simple, hard-won way. Tommy had moved to Portland and enrolled in community college, studying literature at age 19, with the perspective of someone who had seen the future. He was writing poetry now, strange verses about time and loss and finding yourself in the wreckage. Delilah had become an activist again, working with families who had lost loved ones to police violence, to wrongful convictions, to all the ways the system failed people. She was fighting for the brother who had died 36 years ago, and all the brothers and sisters who had died since. The revolution continued. Father O'Shea had left the priesthood, unable to reconcile his experience with his faith. He worked now at a homeless shelter, finding God in service rather than ceremony. Lisa had been adopted by a family in Berkeley, given a second chance at the childhood that had been stolen from her twice over. She was in therapy, working through trauma that couldn't be easily categorized or treated. Harold Nichols was found dead in a motel in Reno 6 months after their emergence, the victim of an overdose. He was buried in a pauper's grave, remembered only by the 12 who had shared his impossible journey. Mr. Henshaw had returned to Amtrak, taking a job as a ticket agent unable to leave the railroad despite everything. He worked the counter at Oakland Station, helping passengers find their trains, and sometimes when vintage engines passed through on special runs, he would watch them with haunted eyes. On the first anniversary of their emergence, the 12 survivors who remained gathered in Salinas at the station where they had disembarked. They stood on the platform where they had first set foot in 2004, looking at the tracks that stretched away into the distance. "Do you think it's still out there?" Tommy asked. "The train?" "I know it is," Margaret said. She had seen the reports, the classified memos that Emily quietly shared with her. Sightings continued, the ghost train appearing and disappearing, carrying its cargo of displaced time through the decades. "What happens to them?" Susan Brooks asked. "The people it picks up? I don't know. Maybe they end up like us, thrown forward, maybe backward, maybe they're still on it, trapped in some kind of loop." Margaret paused. "But if they get off, if they survive it, we'll be here. We'll help them. We'll let them know they're not alone." They stood together in silence. 13 people who had become 12, displaced persons who had found a place. They had lost everything, their times, their identities, their certainties about how the world worked. But they had also gained something: perspective, purpose, and the knowledge that even when impossibility became reality, human beings endured. The sun set over Salinas, painting the sky in colors that were the same in any era, and somewhere on rails that existed in multiple times at once, a train continued its journey, carrying passengers toward destinations unknown, a reminder that time was not as fixed as people believed, that reality had cracks where the impossible leaked through. Margaret pulled out her journal, a new one but continuing the one she'd started in 1968, and wrote, "We are the people who fell through time. We are the ones who lost everything and kept going. Our stories matter because they're true, because they happened, because we're still here to tell them. And if others come after us, displaced and lost and terrified, we'll be waiting. We'll be ready. We'll help them find their way in a world that's moved on without them. This is our story. This is our witness. This is our truth. And somewhere, the train keeps running.